So while we're waiting for the last few people to come through, just good morning again. I'm John Pollack with Chartier, and this is the second in a series, which are also more or less standalone talks that we've entitled Textual Connected Histories and Global Legacies for our good friends at Rare Book School. Remote this year. So we are speaking to you from Philadelphia and Paris, as well as Charlottesville. As I said last time, we at the University of Pennsylvania regularly host Rare Book School in the summers, or several sessions of Rare Book School, I should say. Obviously, we're not doing that this year, so this is our effort to offer some of the thoughts and content that we do during Rare Book School in a different virtual format. And we're delighted to have you all here with us. We have about an hour's worth of talk and then some time for questions following the standard format. So with that, and just again, our repeated thanks to our good friends and colleagues at Rare Book School for organizing this, helping us manage the technical challenges, which we will endeavor to make function for better, not for worse today. We're just a couple of more people still coming in, but I think we'll get started with our talk, which is entitled Translating the Brief Relation of Bartolomé de Las Casas. So Roger.
Okay, good morning for everyone. Las Casas, brevísima relación de la destrucción de las Indias, is a paradigmatic case of these works that crossed frontiers, circulated in various languages, moved from one discursive genre to another, and received different meanings in different times and in different places. Our presentation will focus on the edition and translation of this text printed between 1552 and 1822. This talk is quite entirely based on the corpus of Las Casas editions belonging to the collection constituted by the Philadelphian collector Robert Deckert and donated to the University of Pennsylvania in 1960, where it joined the Charles Lee's collection. For understanding the successive interpretation and appropriation of Las Casas' famous work, we propose to divide its history into 7 successive lives, as it is the case for the life of the cats in some Mediterranean legends. The first life is well known. It begins with its first printing at Seville in 1552, when the work was printed at the same time than 7 other treatises, tratados, that Las Casas had prepared over the 10 preceding years. The title page, you see, proposed a strong contrast between, on the one hand, the centrality of the coat of arms of the Emperor, Charles V, and the reference to his motto, Piu plus ultra, that is to say, the motto designating the sovereignty of the King of Castile on the walls situated beyond the Hercules columna, the columns of Hercules. And on the other hand, the absence on the title page and also in the book itself of any permission to publish, licencia, any privilege, any censorial approbation, aprobaciones, normally required and printed in any Spanish Golden Age book. The reason could be either that Las Casas wanted to avoid the regular mechanism of censorship delegated since 1502 to the Archbishop of the city in Seville, or that a tacit authorization had been given for the publication by the Prince Philip, the future Philip II, who was in charge at the time of the Indies, and who had favorably welcomed Las Casas when he came back to Spain in 1547, where he would stay until his death in 1566. Each word of Las Casas' title is carefully chosen in order to assure the readers of the authenticity and credibility of the text. The text is a relation, a genre that implies normally the testimony of an eyewitness. It has been written by a Dominican de la Orden de Santo Domingo. Las Casas joined the order in 1523, and Las Casas became bishop. He was consecrated Bishop of Chiapas in 1544, but resigned in 1550, nevertheless, por el obispo Don Fray Bartolomeo de las Casas. And also, the author claims to belong to a Sevillan noble family, the Kazas, an addition that carried a particular value in a time when aristocratic testimonies were considered more likely to be true because they were not guided by any economic interest. The relation here is brevissima, the first word in the title, very brief, according to one of the classical rhetorical figures of speech, the brevitas. It would be a summary of an infinite history of cruelties committed by the Spaniards in the Indies. As you see, the relation is also colegida, a collection of several accounts. This claim might appear paradoxical if the veracity of the text we stressed upon the personal eyewitness observation of its author, Las Casas. Yet, the verb colegir, as defined in Covarrubias' Tesoro de la Lengua Castellana o Española, published in 1611, meant, I quote, to assemble numerous different things heard, seen, or read. Direct observation and written text with authority, what it is seen and what it is read, can have equivalent strength and authority as they had at the time in the anthologies of commonplaces. The printer's name does not appear on the title page, which includes only the date of printing, 1552. However, the colophon tells us that it was printed, the text, in Seville by Sebastián Trujillo. The text published in 1552 had been written by Las Casas 10 years earlier when he came to Spain to convince the emperor to reform the 1513 laws of Burgos that governed the Spanish policy in America. According to Las Casas, it was urgent to suppress three institutions: the encomienda that recommended Indians to a Spanish master who must teach them the Christian faith in exchange of forced labor in fields or in mines; the repartimiento, or distribution of the Indian between encomenderos that destroyed Indian communities and families; and the requerimiento, that was a legal fiction according to which the Indian willingly adopted the Christian faith and swore obedience to the crown of Castile. And if they did not, they could be punished. For Las Casas, these three institutions had in fact produced the enslavement of the Indians, allowed the worst cruelties perpetrated by the conquistadors, and led to the destruction of the Indies. That is to say, in the Latin etymology of the term, the radical depopulation of the New World. I quote Las Casas from your modern translation, the Penguin one. The despotic and diabolical behavior of the Christians has, over the last 40 years, led to the unjust and totally unwarranted death of more than 12 million souls, women and children among them. And there are grounds for believing my own estimate of more than 15 millions to be near the mark. Such a situation was also a peril for the king, whose authority was challenged by feudal encomenderos who had appropriated the land and who had ruined the monarch by devastating and depopulating the highlands and the mainland that had been conquered in his name. In 1542, when it was written, for the largest part. The Brevísima Relación reflected the crisis of Spanish colonization, the atrocities committed by the conquistadors that deprived their victim of the salvation promised by the true faith, and that sent their perpetrators to an eternal punishment, led to question the legitimacy of Spanish sovereignty over the New World. As you know, in 1493, the Pope had transmitted to the King of Castile and also the King of Portugal the sovereignty over the newfound lands in the Atlantic. The theologians of the University of Salamanca opposed to the legitimacy of such potestas, arguing for the Thomist philosophy of natural law that recognized the sovereignty of indigenous princes and, as a consequence, required that the wars against the Indians must be founded on just titles. In 1552, 10 years after, when he published the 8 Tratados, Las Casas was a disappointed man. His project of a peaceful and missionary colonization that began in 1537 in Guatemala has failed. In his diocese of Chiapas, where he arrived in 1544, the conflict with the inhabitants and the local authorities has forced him to resign in 1550. Moreover, in 1547, the monarch has repealed laws and ordinances proclaimed 5 years earlier, the Leyes Nuevas, inspired largely by Las Casas, that prohibited the enslavement of Indians, freed those already enslaved, and declared that the Indians cannot be transmitted through inheritance to the heirs of an encomendero. Finally, his famous dispute with the Doctor Sepulveda in Valladolid in 1550 had remained inconclusive. In this context, Las Casas Brevísima took on a prophetic and apocalyptical cast. By destroying Indians through forced labor, excessive taxes and tributes, and violent massacres, the Spaniards had gravely offended God. Divine anger would lead to divine retribution. Those who drowned their victims or burned them alive would suffer the same fates themselves. But God's vengeance would be far more sweeping than that. The destruction of the Indies foretold the forthcoming destruction of Spain itself. The prophetic theme forecasting the punishment of a cruel and tyrannical kingdom was frequent in millenarium circles. Here, it is linked closely to the horrors of the conquest. It was the reason why Las Casas wrote his prophetic writing. I quote him again from a modern translation. "I do not wish to see my country destroyed as a divine punishment for sins against the honor of God and the true faith." Las Casas, however, had not abandoned the project to send missionaries who would substitute peaceful conversion for brutal enslavement. In Seville in 1552, his task was twofold. On the one hand, he tried once again to convince the Prince Philip and the Emperor Charles to declare the necessary reforms. Along with the Relación, Las Casas printed 3 treatises that justified the universal principle or universal sovereignty of the King of Castile and Leon over the Indies, but a legitimacy that nevertheless is recognized first to the kings and natural rulers of these people. And this legitimacy of the sovereignty of the natural rulers can be forfeited only if these rulers opposed the teaching of the Christian faith or practiced human sacrifice. On the other hand, it was urgent for Las Casas to give the 21 Dominicans who would leave for Chiapas the text they would need for their mission. They would bring with them the summary of argument exchange with Sepulveda, and two tratados justifying the suppression of the encomienda and the suppression of slavery. And also, they have to bring with them the rules for the confession of the encomenderos, who were obliged to repent and grant proper restitution and reparation to their victims.
This is a brief interlude here to actually do our best to show you physical aspects of books that we cannot show you in reality. Las Casas' 8 separately printed treatises are generally found bound together. And the binding, we could say, transforms these brief octavo pamphlets into a book. Although we could also say this was a book that Las Casas never actually composed in that form. The Kislak Center at the University of Pennsylvania actually has 2 copies of these treatises bound together. Both copies are in early parchment bindings, and you see one example here in the middle of your screen. On the right, you see a manuscript table of contents for that copy, suggesting that one early owner is essentially listing the contents of these pamphlets for this book. Both copies, as I said, are in early bindings. One of the copies, a page of which is pictured on the left in the Deckard collection, contains extensive contemporary marginal notes, as well as continuous manuscript foliation of its pages. Again, an owner thinking of this collection of treatises as a book. The copy on the right is actually also paginated in a contemporary hand, but in a different way. So again, it's hard for us to do this virtually, but the comparison of these early bound copies is a project to be done.
The Brevissima Relation took on a second life when 3 translations were published in a political charged moment dominated by 2 crises: the Protestant revolt in the Spanish Low Countries and the conflict between Spain and England. The first translation into Dutch was published in 1578 in Antwerp, au possible Brussels. The second, a French version by a Flemish Protestant, Jacques de Migrod, appeared in 1579 in Antwerp, on the left side. And Migrod translation was in turn translated into English in 1583 as the Spanish colony on the right. As indicated by the title page of the French translation printed at Antwerp, and by the address to the reader of the English one, the context of the publication and reception of this translation was profoundly different from the context of the publication, the original publication of the text in 1552. In January 1579, the 7 Calvinist provinces of the Northern Low Countries has formed the Union of Utrecht to defend their religious identity against the tyranny of a Catholic and foreign sovereign, the King of Spain. The intention behind the translation of Las Casas' work is clear. You can see this on the title page. Pour servir d'exemple et d'avertissement aux 17 provinces du Pays-Bas, or in the English version, to serve as a precedent, and warning to the 12, for 17, provinces of the Low Countries. The distich below the title reads, Heureux celui qui devient sage en voyant d'autrui le dommage. And according to a more faithful translation than the English one in 1583, the translation could be, happy he would become wise by learning from others' demise. Recalling the crime committed by the Spaniard in America was a way to alert all who might be tempted to ally with them in the Low Country, and particularly the Catholic in the South. The translator Jacques de Migrod gave the two reasons for publishing his translation dedicated to all the provinces of the Lao country. And his text is such translated in 1583 in English. The first reason, that awakening themselves out of their sleep, they may begin to think upon God's judgment and refrain from the wickedness and vice. The other, that they may also consider with what enemies they are to deal, and so to behold, as it were, in a picture or a table, what they are like to be at, when through their recklessness, quarrels, controversies, and partialities themselves have opened the way to such an enemy, and what they may look for. In Migros translation, and then in the English translation, the destruction of the Indies, which for Las Casas prefigure that of Spain, announced the possible destruction of the Low Countries. If their inhabitants did not deeply amend themselves and remain only réformés que de bouche, only reform in words only, and if they did not unite against an arrogant enemy. This new context explains the transformation of the title, Tyrannie et cruauté des Espagnols, which is reproduced, if not in the title page of the Spanish colony, at least in the advice to the reader, as you can see on the right. Cruelties undermine both Christian morality, which calls for love of one's neighbor, and natural law, which demands the pursuit of the common good. Tyrannies, a word frequently used by Las Casas in his Spanish text, designates in the 16th century political lexicon the arbitrary and illegitimate seizure of subjects' goods and bodies by a despotic prince, for example, the Ottoman Sultan. The conquest of territories in the Indies without regard for the title held by the natural rulers, along with the violence committed upon the Indians themselves, who were massacred or worked to death through forced labor, were frightening examples of such tyrannies understood as violation of the divine and natural law. The text of Las Casas, faithfully translated, as it is said on the title page, is the most truthful indictment of the nefarious plans of the Spanish nation, more effective even than any anti-Spanish polemical pamphlets could be. It could serve as an example, like the exemplar deployed by preachers in their sermons, and as a warning to readers. Once aware of this recent American history, the readers could and should act to avoid its repetition in the Low Countries, figured as here the New Indies. A last effect of the political intention of the translation is to define a book as a collection of Las Casas text, adding to the translation of the Brevissima other tratados, but not the 7 tratados, other tratados or fragment of tratados printed in 1552. Some extract for the 8th remedy, where it is proved that the Indians must never be given to the Spaniard en encomienda, and also the summary of the dispute between Las Casas and Sepulveda. This short Las Casian corpus will be frequently followed in subsequent translation. It is contained, for example, in the English translation of Jacques de Migrod's translation, printed in London in 1583. The unnamed and still unknown translator appear on the title page only with this initial MMS. Like the French text, the English translation underscores the Spanishness of the author, Las Casas, which serves to bolster the truth of his claim condemning the Spanish colony. You see the title, briefly described in the Castilian language by Bishop Friar Bartolomé de Las Casas or Cazaos, a Spaniard of the Order of San Dominic, and faithfully translated with this curious version of the name of Migrod on the title page in English by James Aligrodo. The preliminary of the book, along with the extract of the treatises of Las Casas, are all printed, as you can see, in Roman typeface, whereas the body of the account is printed in black letter or Gothic typeface, a typographical choice that anglicized a text located within the context by its title, located within the context of the first English colonial ambitions. We must also place the publication of the Spanish colony, to which you could be opposed an English colony, among a group of books and pamphlets produced in the early 1580s, all which focusing English readers' attention on events in the Low Country and more generally on the threat represented by the Spanish enemy. In 1583 also, the same year, a powerful account by Thomas Stocker of the violence in the Low Countries used nearly the same language on its title page as a translation of the Brevissima Relation. It denounced, I quote, the barbarous cruelty and tyranny of the Spaniards. 5 years before the defeat of the invincible, although actually vanquished, Armada, this publication of litanies of cruelties perpetrated by the Spanish in the Low Country and in the New World sought to convince readers that the Spanish were prepared to commit similar crimes against any people, any nation who rebelled against or resisted their authority. In 1598, the first Latin translation of Las Casas' text was published in Frankfurt by Theodore de Bry. This edition was illustrated by a series of 17 engravings, which gives the Brevissima Relation its third life. The image depicts the most horrifying of the torment described in the book. The image in the book, and not necessarily the frontispiece you have on this screen. The Indians of Debris in the book are tormented, mutilated, killed. They are modern martyr figures. On the engravings, the massacre of Indians recall the massacre of the innocents on the left, recall the torture endured by the saints on the right, like Saint Lawrence on the grill, and recall also or remember the suffering of the flagellated, humiliated, and crucified Christ. On the right, you have this figure of this anchor, quite identical to the cross. These engravings mobilized 3 different iconographic tradition and repertoire for exposing Spanish barbarity. The tradition of martyrdom, as we have seen, the metaphor of hell as a pit, and you have this on the left, and also the representation of cruel hunting with this barbarous dogs and barbarous behavior of the conquistador. The 17 engravings were issued in the context of a war of images between Protestants and Catholics amidst the tumult of the wars of religion. They responded to another series of 29 engravings published in 1587, quite 10 years previously, in Antwerp, a city that had become a Catholic bastion, and a series printed by Richard Verstegen. Under the title Theatrum Crudelitatum Hereticorum Nostri Temporis, these engravings, made by an English Catholic in exile, showed the violent act committed by Protestants in England, and it's on the right, but also in France, we have this on the left, and in the Lao countries on the right. As you see, far from inviting viewers to identify themselves with the blessed fate of the victims, as was the case with images of the martyred saints, Verstegen's engravings were an appeal to vengeance against a cruel Protestant enemy. In his iconographic response, Debris did not choose to publish a book showing the cruelties of the Catholics in Europe. His choice was to substitute the Indians for the Reformed Protestants and to point to the violence in a new world. The abominable cruelties perpetrated against the Indians were a reminder, a warning of the atrocity that the Spaniards had or could exercise against Protestant peoples and nations everywhere. Probably based on this watercolors illustration that accompany a manuscript of Migrot translation prepared for a 1582 Parisian new edition, but finally the edition will be published without any illustration. The 17th engravings engraved by Debris circulated in Germany and in Lao countries in two parallel ways. First, as separate sets of images, and second, as included within the German and Dutch translation of the Brevissima Relation. A German translation had been first printed in 1597, a year before the Latin edition, likely by Debris, but without any illustration. In 1599, the engravings present in the Latin translation were issued as a series of separate sheets gathered together, each set containing the 17 images, and as you can see on the right, a brief text in German, which is the citation of the passage in the book corresponding to the engraving. The same year, 1599, the German edition printed 2 years before was republished by Debris with the addition of the 17 engravings included in the book with their own title and separate signature, as you have seen here in the set of the engraving on different sheets. And the engravings were also included in numerous later Dutch editions published at the beginning of the 17th century by Cornelis Claes in 1609, 1610, and by Ludwig van der Plasse in 1620, and then 1621, 23, 24. We can recall that half of the modern edition of Las Casas were Dutch translations. In 1620, Jan Evert Kloppenburg made the parallel suggested by Debris engraving explicit by joining together in a single book two mirrors, the mirror of the Spanish tyranny in the West Indies, in his own edition of Las Casas, and the mirror of the cruelties committed by the Duke of Alba in the Low Country. You have here the French edition on the right and the Dutch one on the left. Each engraving in these two mirrors is accompanied by 8 lines of verse and set up systematic parallels between the violence committed by the Spanish on both sides of the Atlantic. The 17 engravings by Debris are preceded by 20 engravings that show the execution of Dutch nobles, followed by engravings showing the massacre committed by the Duke of Alba and the Duke of Parma in several cities of the Low Countries. The lesson is clear. Even if Spain and the United Provinces had not been at war since 1609, when a 12 years truce was signed, the threat remains ever present, and the reader in the Lower Country, and particularly in the Calvinist provinces, must be vigilant. Circulating in these different forms, the 17 debris engravings played a crucial role in the construction of what Julián Juderías, early in the 20th century, labeled as the leyenda negra, the black legend that stigmatized Spain, and the use of the word legend by Julián Juderías allowed him to deny any reality to the supposed crime of the Spaniards.
However, just to complicate things even more, the significance of those engravings shouldn't overshadow some others as well, engravings that were made shortly before those for the 3-volume Latin and German editions of Girolamo Benzoni's Historia del Mondo Nuovo. Benzoni's book was published by Dubry in Frankfurt between 1594 and 1597. Benzoni's Historia had actually first been published in Italian in Venice in 1565, then translated into Latin in 1578, and then in 1579 into French by the Genevan pastor Urbain Chauveton, and then into German. You're looking at the German edition here. It was Benzoni's text, as much as, or perhaps even more than the work of Las Casas, that most inspired anti-Spanish sentiment in the early modern period.
The fourth life of the treatise of Las Casas was a Mediterranean and politicized one. 3 Venetian editions were published. The first in 1626 and after in 1630 and 1643, re-edition of this edition. All 3 editions have the same translator, Giacomo Castellani, but is hidden behind a pseudonym on the first edition. As you can see, Francisco Bersabita. All were printed by the same publisher, Marco Ginami, and all share the same page layout with 2 columns of text, the Spanish text on the left side of the page, printed in Roman character, and the Italian translation on the right, printed in italics. The preface presents the purpose of this edition. I quote, "The pontiffs, the popes, will see how, on the pretext of the concession granted by their predecessors to the King of Spain in order to convert the Indians to the faith of Christ, they sent thousands upon thousands into the mouth of hell." The publication of this translation of the Brevissima Relation, Brevissima Relatione, was located in the conflict between the Republic of Venice and the popes. It was a weapon for the Republic of Venice, deployed against the papacy, with which Venice had been in conflict since the Venetian interdict of 1606, as against Spain, as represented by the diplomatic and military tension between the Venetian and the Viceroy of Naples in 1617 and again in 1622. The sole 17th century Spanish edition shows us another different example of the political appropriation of the Brevissima Relation. It was the edition printed in Barcelona in 1646 by Antonio La Cavalleria. And this version unites under the title Las Obras del Obispo Don Fray Bartolomé de las Casas o Casaos 5 of the 8 treatises printed in 1552. Slight modification in the titles of 3 of these treatises give us an indication of the reason for this new and only edition in Spanish before the beginning of the 19th century. You can see the word por los castellanos, by the Castilians, were added first to the end of the title of the first Tratados, brevísima relación de la destrucción de las Indias Occidentales por los castellanos. And of course, it was not present in the original text. Similarly, the fourth treatise referred to the fact that the Indians were forced into slavery by the Castilian, que se han hecho esclavos por los castellanos. And in the title of the 30 propositions, the second treatises, the claim of sovereignty over the West Indies is said to have been granted to los Reyes de Castilla. And in the original text, it was the Reyes of Castilla and Leon. Leon disappeared. So the term Castellano is here, not a synonym of Spaniards. Instead, it stigmatized the sole Castilians as guilty of the crime committed in America, exempting the other people of Spain. The Catalans here mobilized Las Casas for the war against Philip IV and the Count Duke of Olivares. This war began with the revolt of the Segadors in June 1640 and led Pau Claris and the Junta of Brazos, la Generalitat, to proclaim in January 1641 the Catalan Republic and to place it under the protection of Louis XIII of France, whom the Catalan named Count of Barcelona. This war consisted mainly of a war of sieges between the Catalan insurgents and their French allies, and on the other hand, the armies of the Castilian king. The 1646 publication of 5 of Las Casas treatises is the part of this context of war, and it unites Catalans and Indians as previous or potential victims of the same Castilian tyranny. In 1656, a new translation of the Brevissima Relation was published in English and in London. It was the work of John Phillips, a nephew of Milton. The text, and we can see it, was newly entitled as the Tears of the Indians, a title perhaps inspired by a 1642 pamphlet, The Tears of Ireland, which was a denunciation of massacre committed by the popish faction upon Irish Protestants.
It's of course difficult to perceive this on the screen, but this is a very small format book. There's only one illustration, and it's an added engraving, a fold-out, illustrated, visible here on the right, which is actually made up of 4, so it's an assemblage of 4 images, rather poor imitations of the debris engravings.
And we see the Innocents, St. Lawrence, and the Anchor as cross. They have chosen this image, and the hunting. So the main iconographic references were kept in this fold-out engraving. In the translation by Phillips, the tears of the Indians, a new title again, are biblical tears, based upon a passage from the 9th chapter of the book of Jeremiah. I quote, "Never had we so just a cause to exclaim in the words of the prophet Jeremiah, oh, that our heads were waters, and our eyes fountains of tears, that we might weep for the effusion of so much innocent blood." The text presents itself on its title page, as you can see, as a historical and true account of the cruel massacre and slaughters of above 20 millions of innocent people committed by the Spaniards. It reminds reader that the account was written by a Spanish eyewitness. Even if in this English Puritan version, Las Casas is no longer described either as a bishop or as a Dominican, only written in Spanish by Kaza, an eyewitness of those things. The Tears of the Indians have three goals. The first is to prize Cromwell as a new David, a new Joshua, who is crushing idolatry in the world to His Highness or Lord Protector. A second goal is to advocate for unity among all true Englishmen. They must not tear themselves apart in civil wars, but instead fight together against their formidable enemy. The third goal is to assert the English right to the West Indies, discovered by Sebastian Cabot, one of the Henry VII's captain. But, as said John Phillips, the poor spirit of English kings had caused them to neglect this initial advantage. To conquer these golden regions would be the surest means of weakening an already weakened Spanish empire, an empire surviving on blood and on tyranny. I quote, "Should we chase him from his Indian treasures, he would soon retire to his shell like a snail tapped upon the horns." This version of Las Casas presents the Spanish who claim to be Christians as barbarian, even worse than pagan and Turks. They persecute the Indian as the Roman emperors had persecuted the first Christians. These innocent souls demand a redeemer. Cromwell will be this redeemer. In John Phillips' appropriation of Las Casas, the political interest of England and the God-given mission of the Lord Protector and his people are one and the same. At the very end of the 17th century, a group of three editions gave yet another life to the text of Las Casas, sixth life, and a surprising new significance. The first of this edition appeared in Paris in 1697, and on its title page, as you can see, destruction, cruelties, tyrannies, tears have entirely vanished. Morvan de Bellegarde, the translator, and André Pralard, the publisher, entitled their version La découverte des Indes occidentales, the discovery of the West Indies. The frontispiece, on the right, shows a formal civil meeting between Hernán Cortés and Emperor Moctezuma, who exchanged gifts in a pastoral landscape. The book's running title, printed above each page, read Voyage des Espagnols dans les Indes, Spanish Voyages to the Indies. Las Casas text had been reimagined as a travelogue, describing the riches of the New World. The author of the preface, though, grapples with one important difficulty. This voyage narrative is also a tale of cruelties. I quote, "All of the cruelties committed by the Spaniards in the New World could scarcely be believed if they had not been reported by the Spaniards themselves, by several faithful eyewitnesses, and among others, by the Most Reverend Don Barthélemy de Las Casas, Bishop of Chiapas. For its new genre, therefore, the text requires some modification or alteration. I quote, "We have in some places softened things that may seem too cruel and that might have offended genteel persons." Despite this curious mutation, the work is nevertheless faithful to the short Las Casian corpus. It adds to the translation of the Brevissima Relación excerpts from the two other tratados and from the debate with Sepulveda. The following year, 1698, a pirated version of the Parisian edition is printed in Amsterdam. This edition is an exact reprint of the French text with a nearly identical title, dedication, and frontispiece, with some slight differences in the frontispiece which introduce some violent acts which were not present in 1697 in the French one. The Dutch bookseller publisher Jean-Louis Delorme does add a preface to readers who would have been surprised by the publication of this text in France only 12 years after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes had ended all toleration for Protestants in the Kingdom of France. Alluding to Sepúlveda's argument in his debate with Las Casas, the preface indicates, we see here a Spanish doctor filled with a persecuting zeal and won over by the persecutor of the Indians, using nearly the same arguments against them as we have seen lately used against Protestants in France. But he added, we shall see on the other hand, Don Bartolomé de las Casas presenting the same arguments in favor of the Indians that Protestants have presented and are still presenting today in opposition to this persecuting spirit. Despite this reminder, however, the edition in this Dutch pirated contrefaçon is presented as a pleasant travel narrative.
And you can just glimpse on this title page, just a little bit tightly bound, that to continue the theme of pleasant travelogues, Las Casas' text here is actually published with another travelogue, the Relations curieuses des voyages du Sieur de Montauban, a captain of pirates whose journey along the coast of Guinea was an extraordinary adventure, quote unquote. These two texts are printed with continuous signatures and pagination, as if they were addressed to the same horizon of expectations. In the copy owned by the Library of the University of Pennsylvania, they're actually also bound with a third text, which is not referenced on this title page, but also published by Delorme, entitled L'Art de Voyager Utilement, that confirms this new reception of Las Casas' relation as a travelogue.
And in 1699, a London edition was published containing in one volume the French translation translated and, as said John now, the art of traveling to advantage. The book makes evidence the ambiguous new status of Las Casas text as a travelogue. On the title page, the number of victims of Spanish cruelty is twice than reported in John Phillips' edition of 1656, from 20 million to 40 million. Moreover, the text is also accompanied by a series of engravings, drastically simplified version of the debris plates. This engraving associates a single image, not only with one page of the text, but as you can see, with all the different passages referenced by the number of by the page number, all the different passages of the book narrating the same cruel acts. The travelogue remains thus fundamentally, in this English edition of the late 17th century, a denunciation of Spanish tyrannies. The intent of this edition is also to erase any Catholic dimension from Las Casas' text and person. The Bishop of Chiapas became, in this edition, in fact, a precursor of the Glorious Revolution. I quote, "It may well surprise a reader to hear a Spanish prelate declaim so loudly against persecution and plead so freely for liberty of conscience in a country subjugated to the Inquisition, and to hear him assert the natural right of all mankind to liberty and property, and inveigh against all usurpation and tyranny in the smartest terms. Of course, Las Casas had been wrong to recognize the Pope's power and authority. But nevertheless, I quote, this bishop writes with such an air of honesty, sincerity, and charity, as would very well have become one of a better religion than that in which he had the unhappiness to be educated. Liberty of conscience, natural right of property, language of reason. Indeed, Las Casas should have been a Protestant rather than a Catholic. And without knowing it, he was more English, in fact, than Spanish. I quote, the above mentioned principle of the Bishop of Chiapa concerning property and liberty, both civil and religious, are more agreeable to the genius and constitution of this highland, Great Britain, than to the present temper of that part of the continent which lies nearest to it. The final metamorphosis and the seventh life of the Brevissima Relata, at least for today, emerges in the multiple reedition of the Spanish text that were produced during the wars of independence between the colonies and the metropolis during the decades of the 1810s and 1820s. The original text of Las Casas had never been reprinted in Spanish since 1552. With the sole exception we have seen of the Barcelona edition in 1646. Now it came to serve the cause of the American liberty. The geography of the printing of this edition is new, with Spanish editions printed in London and in Philadelphia, and with a series of editions issued in the Spanish colonies as they move toward independence. The title page of the 1821 Philadelphia edition on the left notes at the bottom that the text had been previously edited in Seville, 1552, and in London, 1812. But Las Casas text was also reprinted before and after this Philadelphian edition. It was printed in Bogota in 1830, in Puebla in 1821, in Mexico City and Guadalajara in 1822. And we have on the right part of the image the title page of the edition in Guadalajara, 1822. In the Philadelphia edition and some other I mentioned, Dr. Don Servando Teresa Mier, author of Historia de la Revolución de Nueva España in 1813, transformed Las Casas into a saint, into a prophet of the American Revolution. In his preliminary discourse, he addresses the people of America. I quote, Americans, we have no statue of this saint on our territory. If you are free people, as I do no doubt, the very first statue that you erect must be that of the first and oldest defender of American liberty. I shall have this word inscribed upon it. Halt here, lovers of virtue. This is its face. Venerate Las Casas, the father of our Indians. From here, since it would be impossible to restore the right of the first inhabitants, destroyed as they were by the tyranny Las Casas has denounced, the Creoles, born in America, become in a certain sense the new Indians, themselves threatened, as were the Indians, by the war to death declared upon them by metropolitan Spain. The war pursued by Spanish generals and Spanish armies, I quote, repeat over and over the tragic scenes of the conquest. Paradoxically, Las Casas treaties, which denounced the cruelties of conquistadors and of encomenderos, is brandished here by their descendants as a weapon in their battle for independence. They will vanquish their enemies because the course of history will prove that the prophetic Dominican was right. I quote, it is possible that the prediction of Las Casas of the end of the Spanish Empire in the Indies already came true. The publication of the 2 volumes of the Œuvre of Las Casas in Paris in 1822 and in French is the final stage of our journey. This edition was edited by Juan Antonio Llorente. The 1822 Œuvres that were published in Spanish in the same years as Obras included a life of Don Barthélemy de Las Casas, edited 5 of the treatises, including the Brevissima Relation, and also edited previously unpublished manuscripts held in the Royal Library. And also in the book, you can find letters and writings related to Las Casas' controversial position on the importation of African slaves into Indies. Llorente's edition is at the same time a plea in favor of the Creoles, a defense of Las Casas' reputation against this accusation, which is in itself a very complicated issue, but clearly it was not Las Casas who has introduced slavery of the African slaves in America, and the learned work of Las Casian studies. In this book, we may perceive the beginning of a new age of interpretation of the Brevissima Relation and a new age of the celebration of Las Casas. Mir was heard later, as proved by the statue of Las Casas erected in America after in the 19th or 20th century. You can see here, it's a sample. On the upper level, a statue in La Habana, Guatemala City, and Santo Domingo, and on the lower level, the statue in San Cristobal de las Casas in Mexico, in Santiago de Cuba, and in Buenos Aires, with this curious proximity between Las Casas and 3 conquistadores. But time to conclude. The textual connected history of Las Casas' relation raised 3 fundamental issues beyond the textual study itself. First, they offer an example of the mobility of a text that did not change in its literality, but whose meaning was deeply transformed when the translations located in successive horizons of expectation. Secondly, we can see how these different historical contexts were inscribed in the books themselves. The transformation of the title, the justification offered by the preliminaries, the choices concerning layout and character, all these elements expressed the reason and rationale for the translation and publication. Finally, the difference between the edition without any images and the edition that after 1598 reproduced the series of engraving printed by Debris illuminates the tension in the early modern period between ekphrasis, that is to say, the figure of speech that produce mental images by the sole power of discourse, and the role attributed to the images considered as able to produce pathetic emotion that the sole words cannot produce. If we are faithful to Mackenzie's famous motto, forms, effect, meaning, we must stress, consequently, the unique importance of the rare book collection and the decisive work made by curators and librarians. In a world where digital reproduction and online consultation permit us easy access to text, as demonstrated today by this presentation, it is necessary, however, to recall that only precise analysis of the printed and manuscript objects themselves can allow us to understand how the materiality of the books shaped the meaning of the text. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much for this fabulous discussion. My name is Camille Davis. I'm the program associate here at Rare Book School, and I will be co-moderating this session along with my colleague, Laura Idom. And we're accepting questions right now. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat, and I would be very happy to read them out loud to our two speakers. So let's start off with a reference question from Margarita Vergas Benatcourt, who asks if the UPenn prints highlighted in this session are digitized.
Thank you for that question. And the answer is partially. There is an enormous and ever-increasing collection of digitized texts, and honestly, not that many of the collects in the Deckard collection, from which much of this was drawn, have been fully digitized, but there are a great many other excellent digital copies of Las Casas out there. There's so many places to try to look for these that it's hard to sum them up. Archive.org, the Internet Archive, is one excellent place, and the John Carter Brown Library has digitized a great many. Most of it's Las Casas holdings, I think, but that's certainly not all. The only place you saw we drew from European libraries as well, and things available through Google Books. So thanks for the question. But it's also worth noting, I think, that having more copies online is not redundant, even though I think it might have at first appeared to be so. One copy is not sufficient when you're studying an early printed book, and I think nor is it sufficient when you're studying the digital version of an early printed book.
I can add that effectively you can find the English translation on early English books. You can find some of the French one in the Gallica, the relatively poor digitalization of some of the books of the Bibliothèque Nationale. And you can find, because we left this aside for various reasons, the Dutch and the German edition on, for a part, the John Carter Brown Library. And also you're looking, it's sometimes a little complicated, but the different collection digitized by German libraries, particularly the Bavarian State Library in Munich, in which you have a lot of these numerous Dutch and German translation, the edition of translation, but particularly the Dutch ones, because as I said, it's half of the edition of Las Casas, in whatever languages you can say, which were published in Dutch in the Netherlands.
All right, thank you. Our next question comes from Jane, who asks, during this period, do you think readers question the accuracy of published statistics, like the destruction of 20 million, then 40 million Indians?
It's difficult to say. No, I don't think so. I think that this 15, 20, 40 millions could be taken at a face value by some reader, but they have also more, they are more a rhetorical device. That is to say, to show something which is beyond what you can imagine or fear. And so the numbers are charged with this symbolic, pathetic meaning, more than something based on the statistical inquiry. It would be an important question to know when the number in the text require this value of actual data. But I think here it was not, it was more, yes, finally, pathetic rhetoric device than the preoccupation for the exactness. The crime was beyond what you can imagine, and so the 40 million of the 1699 text belonged to this perspective. In the case of Las Casas, when he published in 1552, it was based not necessarily about any form of a statistic, which was impossible, but it was based on the eyewitnessing of the situation which happened in Santo Domingo and in Cuba, because he was first, and then as an encomendero, and rapidly converted to the defense of the Indian. He was struck by the depopulation of the island and make a kind of projection for the entire Indies, Western Spanish Indies, of what happened to in Santo Domingo and Cuba when he was there. The only but not curiously, but finally, the work we were done in the 20th century, particularly by the historical demographer at Berkeley, had confirmed the size of the depopulation. They have worked particularly closely on the central part of Mexico. And they have shown how the population was during the period between the arrival of the Spaniard and the beginning of the 17th century, if I remember, was decreased for 20 million to 1 million of Indian living on the central part of Mexico. So the statistical data of the School of Berkeley, as they were named, has confirmed the size of the depopulation. But the topic of the depopulation, which is a way to a form of translation of destruction, which is not only the destruction of the villages, of the fields, and so on. The destruere in Latin has also the meaning of depopulation, was particularly important, not only for the human reason we can all share, but also because the people, the number of the people, was considered as one of the first fundamental elements for the strength of a political power. And the power was identified by this capacity, number of people. It's the reason why Las Casas used the argument, because destroying the population, in a sense, the encomenderos, the conquistadors, were altering the power of the King of Spain. Depriving him of the first riches of any state, that is to say, the number of people able to work. In the mercantilist economic theory, the number of people is one of the first decisive elements.
Great, thank you so much. So our next question comes from Javier Ricardo Ardilla, who first says, thank you so much for an amazing presentation. He would like to know if we have any idea of how this title circulated in its time, late 1816 or early 17th centuries. What kind of buyers acquired it? As an illustrated book, do we have any idea of its cost increase or decrease? And finally, what kind of libraries, private or public, possessed this title?
I answer about the circulation and leave the question of the cost to John. For the circulation, every language raises a specific issue. As we know, the book were since the end of the 16th century, in the 16th century, there was the order to confiscate in the Spanish colonies in America the Las Casas book, not only the Brevissima Relación, but also the other treatises if they have reached the territory of the colonies. So it was a confiscation, and the prohibition by courts was made after the edition of, we have seen, of 1646 in Barcelona. The Aragon and after Castile have banned, prohibited the book. But never, in any case, it was never reprinted. So you can imagine that the circulation of this book in Spanish was very limited, not only by the fact there were no re-edition, but also by the fact that it was either confiscated or in the 17th century prohibited. If you take an extreme other example, it would be the Netherlands in these United Provinces, with this more than 30 edition in the early modern period, 16th, 17th century of the text. You can imagine that if not everyone, but many people, many families had a copy in Dutch of the text by Las Casas. And so it's the answer would be referred to different situation for the different languages. For the illustrated edition, well, I leave to John, because here it's also, it seems to me, a contrast between illustration and illustration. 1598 debris and what we have seen after in this reuse of debris, sometimes very crude reuse, in the English edition more than the other ones.
Right, because if we look at those successive generations of illustrations, we could see a popularization and therefore a wider circulation of the images in the less expensive formats and less expensive single engravings. Because I think it's safe to say that the 1598 Debris and the other editions around it are expensive books. I hate to get started on the question of how much these things cost. I can't give any numbers, and they're very difficult sometimes to ascertain. But you know, the simple truth for early modern books is the more pictures there are and engravings were expensive, the more expensive the book is going to be in most cases. So the debris market is a high-end book market. The scholar Michael van Grossen has done a remarkable series of studies on the debris firm. And if anybody has the answer to the question of costs for the debris workshop, it's van Grossen. We would leave it to him to answer that. And, you know, I think, again, on the question of who owned these books, there's lots of work still to do. This is another argument for looking at as many possible copies as you can to see what we can know about buyers and acquisitions. But pictures, you know, engraved pictures add cost, as well as the size formats. That's another complicated question about the different size choices that Debris made for his editions. Many were folio size. The first Las Casas edition is actually not a large format, and there's an argument there that perhaps Debris was aiming for a slightly wider circulation in 1598, which is an interesting question. Libraries who acquired it, I would imagine this is typically a later phenomenon, 19th, 20th century, for the arrival in institutional libraries as those emerged of these kinds of books.
But as ever for this question, there is two issues. One which is economic and technical, and the other one which is intellectual and epistemological. Economic and technical, as said John, if you think the 1598, the first 17, the first series of the 17 engravings, the text is in Latin. The engravings are copper plate engraving inscribed in the with the text itself. And as you know, for the 16th, 17th century, you cannot print copper plate engraving and typographical text with the same press. So you have to print twice. And with two different presses in two different printing shops, the images and the text on the same page. This increased the cost. So we have, in my knowledge, no census of where we can find now the 1598 Debris edition, but it's clearly now belonging to aristocratic milieu or to a library of community. Whereas, as you have seen for the English edition, John Phillips, 1656, the 1599, first, these engravings are very crude. And even if they are copper plate, some could be on a wooden block. But even if they are copper plate, they are less costly, and particularly because they are no more inscribed within the text. In the both cases that John has shown, it's fold out engraving, which is inserted in the edition, and which raised an issue because sometimes in the 19th or 20th century, the engraving was cut and sold separately. And I remember I have seen the John Phillips edition in the John Carter Brown Library, and there was not the fold out image that we have seen, because in their edition, someone at a certain moment of time had cut the engraving. But the fact to put engraving which are inserted not within the text but within the book lower the cost. So here too, we have to have this differentiated issue. At the same time, as I tried to say at the end, the presence or absence of images could be related to cost, but it could be related also to the question of the power of the word to impose images in the mind of the reader versus the explicit representation of what the text says, or sometimes adding to something to what the text says. It's the case of the 1598. It's not a literal reproduction in the image of some passages. There is an accumulation in the image itself of different elements which are scattered in the text. But here we are confronted to this issue of a model which thinks that the image do not necessarily must be inscribed as such, because the ekphrasis is sufficiently powerful to produce the image in the mind of the reader, versus this presence of the image either thought of as corresponding to the text, and it was more or less what the set of separate images in the German 1599 show. That is to say, they try to adjust a passage of the text or what is represented on the image. Here we are confronted to a kind of a relationship of correspondence between image and text, or appearing since the Renaissance, the idea that the image could produce beyond the understanding of meaning a form of emotion, a form of pathos, pathetic forms of reaction that the text cannot produce. And so when we discuss this complex issue of the relationship between text and image, there are several factors which are to be taken into consideration, from the most technical and economic to the most philosophical or theoretical. How is thought of the role of both. Text can produce images, but images can produce emotions that the text cannot produce. And so it could be a way for entering into this complex relationship.
Thank you very much. We have so many wonderful questions coming in. I think we have time for just one more.
Yeah.
This last one relates to one of the first images that you showed of the De Las Casas text. And that image featured many marginal annotations in Spanish, written in probably a contemporary hand. The question is, do you know something about the reader or writer, or the nature of those marginalia?
So We can answer this relatively quickly, and that question is from our friend Natale. So, ciao Natale, thank you for this question. We don't. We don't know who wrote the annotations. They are extensive, but not throughout. And an undergraduate student of ours did a preliminary paper on working through some of these and attempting to transcribe some of these annotations. They're challenging, but we're hoping she'll continue her project on this, and there's more work to be done. Some of the annotations are summaries, as one might expect from contemporary readers, not necessarily analytical or interpretive, but there are moments like on that particularly dramatic page where the commentary is more significant. So it's work we're hoping to do. It's up to you, Laura. We can take more questions if you like.
All right. Let's see. The next one from Asima says, sadly, ironically, perhaps, Bartolomé de las Casas did not feel the same compassion towards the African slaves. If you mentioned this already, apologies.
This is a very complex issue, and which was raised in the 18th century. What was at stake here, and particularly in the Poe or the Robertson text on the 18th century, was the fact that in the beginning, in the 1516, very early in this trajectory of Las Casas, he imagined that for making less painful this situation of the Indian, could be sent to the Indies some of African slaves as they were present in Spain or Italy at the time. But for Las Casas, it was in the project that the colonization must be missionary and by peasant. And so in the communities, as in Europe, there were this possible presence of the African slave. Las Casas recognized very early that it was a terrible thing to think in this manner. The difficulty was that he expressed more than this regret. It was he expressed a kind of culpability that will be never forgiven by God to him. He expressed this in two texts, the Historia de las Indias, another big treatise, which was an enormous work, never published in the 16th, 17th, or 18th century. The first translation of these two work by Las Casas, in which is expressed very clearly the idea according to which its excuse will never erase the sanction of the God judgment, where these texts which were published, one I am looking for the reference in the late 19th century, and the other one in the beginning in the 20th century, La Historia de las Indias, the first edition in 1875-76 in Madrid. And so the discussion happened in the 18th century based on the reading of a text by Herrera, when, as I said, Cornelius de Poe or Robertson assigned the blame to Las Casas for the origin of the slave trade. But immediately there was a defense of Las Casas without knowing necessarily his own feeling of culpability. It was a defense both by Raynal in the Histoire des deux Indes and in the longer version of this lecture, there is a quote by Raynal, who anticipated what said Meyer, and said that the first statue in the free America would be necessarily a statue of Las Casas. And there was also the defense of Las Casas by the Abbé Grégoire during the French Revolution, which tried to establish that it was not possible to defend the idea that Las Casas was the introducer of the slavery of the African in America. I quote the text by Abbé Grégoire, quoted by Llorente in the work we mentioned of 1822. The trade of between Africa and Europe was begun by the Portuguese at least 30 years before the birth of Las Casas. The transport of black slaves to America, according to all historians, preceded by 14 and perhaps even 19 years the time of the plan ascribed to Las Casas of substituting them for the Indians. So even in the 18th century, there was a division about this issue. But now, yes, of course, what we can say historically is the fact that the Las Casas in the 1516 text, which is Memorial de Remedios para las Indias, in 1516, the first time he came back in Spain, was on this basis. And of course, it's a fundamental question. It's a question about the acceptance of slavery, a form of domestic slavery. It was not the time of the plantation. It was the time of, in Spain, in Portugal, in Italy, in the south of France, you can find African slaves within the household or within the domestic in the of their owners. And so, just what I can say, I just can say this, that Las Casas made this repentance in the Historia de las Indias, but known only in the late 19th century. So the defense in the 18th century was more about the impossibility to attribute to a single man, and on the basis of a single text, in 1516, the Remedios para las Indias, the slavery, which was already developed in the very early for the colonization in Santo Domingo or in Cuba.
Should we take perhaps Eduardo's question?
One more question? Yeah. I'd be happy to. So Eduardo Gutierrez asks, do you find any difference between translations of the following terms of slavery, quote, Indians, quote, tyranny, along time and also various languages?
It's a good question. I am not sure that the difference appear with these three terms, because tyrannias in the original text was translated tyrannies, tyranny, and so on. Indians, Indios, in the beginning, this there was in use. And for slavery, esclavitud, esclavos, slavery, esclav, were the same. And in this sense, it belongs to what I say at the end, that is to say a text which is not changing fundamentally in its literality, with one exception. That is to say the fact that for the people who have read Las Casas, they remember that he used frequently the word Cristianos. And the word Cristianos is used by Las Casas for various reasons. I think one of the most fundamental is to is quite a bitter irony. These Cristianos are behaving not really as Christian. And so to reuse and repeat Cristianos is a manner to show how they have betrayed what were their faith or what were the reason for their encomienda. And so there is this aspect. Another reason is that in the text itself, some of the conquistadors, there is one who is a German, so it's not only the Spaniards. But he used frequently Cristianos. And the translation, the Protestant translation, by Migrod and by the English translator of Migrod, and after have generally suppressed Cristianos every time the word appeared and replaced by Spaniard, les Espagnols. And so what is lost, of course, is this dimension of the Cristianos who were not really Christian. They have to translate as Catholicos if they want to keep something of the original meaning. But it was this the main transformation of the text, because as you know, the Brevissima is brief. There is no particular difficulty in the language for the translator. The text was respected in its structure, which is a geographical structure, which starts with Santo Domingo and end with the Peru. So it's one of these texts which is stable in its literality. And the translation is a factor of mobility of the text, not because it transforms, altered, reshape, suppress, add to the text, but because the translation, the language of the translation is immediately located within the context of the reason for why the text was translated and retranslated. And so the language leads directly to this mobility of the text, which are stable, but which are mobile, because the word of the translator, the word of the readers, the intention for the translation is not the original one, 1552, but it's each time, as we have seen, relocated within some specific historical issues. And so this it's an interesting case, because we work with John about translation. Sometimes the translation is transforming the literality of the text. And in the sense, the translation introduced a textual mobility. In this case of Las Casas, what is interesting is the fact that the translation didn't transform the literality of the text, but profoundly is the first element for the mobility of the meaning of a stable text. Once Pierre Bourdieu said a book you change without changing because the world has changed. So you can apply this to Las Casas. The text has changed, not because the work has changed, not because the text has changed, but because the different words of the moment in this 3-century history we try to describe has created a context of translation, reception, interpretation, appropriation, very different from what was in the mind of Las Casas when he wrote in 1542 and reshaped in 1552. This is his text.
Thank you so much for that fabulous response. And thank you as well for this wonderful presentation from all of us at RBS. Thank you so much. And for the people who are still here, please join us for our final session on Wednesday, this Wednesday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, American Time. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to the RBS programs team. In the meantime, thank you so much to our speakers for this wonderful, wonderful lecture. Thank you.
Have a good day.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.